My name is Sam, and for 6 years I worked as a search and rescue volunteer in the Pacific Northwest. I was part of the local SAR team that would respond when people got lost or stranded in the forest or the mountains. It wasn't a job for the faint of heart. Hours of grueling hikes through dense wilderness, unpredictable weather, and sometimes grim outcomes. I'd helped recover people who had been lost for days, some with hypothermia, some too weak to walk, others weren't so lucky. I've pulled bodies from ravines and frozen creeks, victims of accidents or exposure. I've carried out hikers who fell from unstable rock faces or got turned around in the vast, unforgiving woods. But there was one case, one that still keeps me awake at night, that made me quit for good. I don't tell many people about this story, mostly because I still can't explain what happened out there, but I remember it vividly. The faces, the forest, the sounds, and the howls. The call came in mid-September. A young woman named Rachel Thomas had gone missing during a group hiking trip near Mount Baker National Forest. She was 27 years old, fit, and an experienced hiker, who had been on dozens of backcountry trips before. According to her friends, she had been walking just ahead of the group, only a few yards away, when she vanished. One moment she was there, and the next, she was gone without a sound. Her friends initially thought she'd just stepped off the trail, maybe to use the bathroom or look at something, but when she didn't return after several minutes, they began to shout her name. They backtracked along the path, fanning out into the woods, but still no trace. By the time they reported her missing, they were shaken and confused, swearing that she'd been right in front of them before vanishing. Some of them speculated that she had simply gotten lost or turned around in the thick brush. Others believed she might have fallen into a ravine or a creek. But what didn't make sense was the lack of sound. No scream, no crashing branches, no signs of a struggle. It was as if she'd simply been plucked out of existence. When we finally got the call the next morning, we organised the search team. I was paired with 2 other volunteers, a guy named Marcus and a woman named Leah. Our sector was one of the most remote areas, deep in the forest. It wasn't far from the campsite where Rachel had last been seen, but it was thick with ferns, fallen branches, and wild undergrowth. The kind of place where you could just vanish into the brush and be impossible to spot. We set out with day packs, GPS devices, and radios, spreading out in a staggered line, calling Rachel's name as we trudged deeper into the forest. The first few hours were uneventful, just the usual crunch of leaves underfoot, and the occasional snap of a branch. But as the day wore on, something felt wrong. The current known facts of the case were weighing on our minds. They didn't make sense. If anything, they pointed to potential foul play within Rachel's group of friends. Something like that makes any rescuer feel uneasy. By mid-afternoon, we reached Rachel's last known location, a small remote clearing where her group had set up camp the night before she vanished. The forest around it was dense and unforgiving, with towering evergreens that blocked out most of the light. The canopy above us was so thick that only thin shafts of sunlight managed to pierce through, creating patchy pools of light on the forest. The clearing itself was small and uneven, and overgrown with wild ferns and moss, giving it an almost swallowed-up-by-nature appearance. There were still traces of the group's presence, charred wood from the fire pit, boot prints in the damp soil, and to our chagrin, a few discarded food wrappers. A few yards up the trail was the exact spot from which the group alleged Rachel had disappeared. There were no signs of a struggle, no broken branches, no drag marks, no blood, nothing. We spread out, combing the area for any indication of where she might have gone. Marcus checked the tree line, calling out Rachel's name, while Leah carefully examined the trail leading away from the site. I lingered by the edge of the clearing, staring into the woods, The forest felt strangely silent. Too silent. The usual rustling of squirrels or distant calls of birds was absent. Instead, there was just an unsettling stillness, as if the entire forest was afraid. I exchanged a glance with Leah, and I could tell that she felt it too. Her voice was lower when she spoke, almost hesitant. "It's weird, right?" she muttered, crouching to examine a faint footprint in the dirt. "I think I found her tracks. Look like they end right here, but there's no sign of where she went," she continued. Next to the final footprints was thick, undisturbed brush. It was as though the forest had swallowed her into its bowels. But in some other brush just outside the clearing, there was a hiking pack, and on a tag, the name Rachel was written. Marcus returned moments later, shaking his head, muttering in frustration. "There's no sign of her anywhere. It's like she walked off the face of the earth," he said as he wiped his brow in frustration. This couldn't be. I tried to come up with rational explanations in my head. Although we saw no tracks, given her bag was here, she must have moved off from this point. Maybe she got turned around, veered off path, and was lost somewhere deeper in the woods. Maybe she'd fallen into a sinkhole or a steep ravine, and her friends had just missed it. But the reported lack of any sound or sign of distress gnawed at me. As we continued to search, I couldn't shake the unexplainable sensation that we were being observed. My eyes kept flickering to the darker gaps between the trees, expecting to catch a glimpse of something or someone lurking. But there was nothing, just shadows, and the unnerving silence. We had been searching for hours, moving slowly and methodically through the thick underbrush, calling Rachel's name every few minutes. The forest was oppressively quiet, broken only by the occasional crack of a twig underfoot, or the rustling of leaves as we pushed through. The sun was starting to dip lower, casting long, spindly shadows through the trees. And that's when I heard it. A faint, low murmur, somewhere off to the right. At first I thought it was Marcus or Leah speaking softly, maybe conferring over something they found. But when I turned, they were both just behind me, separated by a few yards, and neither of them was talking. The sound came again, closer this time. A wet, rasping noise, barely louder than a creak of the branches in the breeze. It was fragmented, broken into choppy, uneven bursts, like the garbled breathing of a large animal. But it wasn't consistent. It would stutter and hitch, almost like a cough or a wheeze before continuing in a low, uneven rhythm. I slowed my steps, straining to hear. The sound was wrong, neither fully animal nor human. There was a deep, guttural cadence, almost like a bear's grunt, but layered with a peculiar, wet clicking that didn't fit any animal I knew. Yet it carried a strange wheezing melody that sent a chill crawling up my back. I turned sharply towards the sound, expecting to see movement in the underbrush, but there was nothing, just dense forest and shifting shadows. I asked the others if they heard it too. My voice was lower than I intended. Leah glanced over to me asking, "Hear what?" But before I could answer, Marcus stopped walking. His body tensed slightly and his head tilted to the side, listening. We all stilled ourselves, and that's when the sound came again. This time, directly ahead, just beyond a small copse of gnarled pines. It was louder now, clearer. The noise was heavier, wetter, with a glottal, rattling edge, like something large was struggling for breath and was moving, circling us. Marcus's face hardened. He held up a hand, signaling us to stay quiet. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Leah's eyes narrowed, scanning the tree line. She took a slow, measured step towards me, her voice tight. "That's not a bear, right?" I shook my head slightly, feeling my throat go dry. I'd been in the woods long enough to recognize the vocalizations of local animals, but this was different, completely foreign. The sound was too fluid, too deliberate, with a strange stuttering inflection, as though whatever was making it was attempting but failing at speech. We exchanged brief, uneasy glances. I could feel the weight of the stillness around us, My heart was thudding against my ribs and my hands were starting to prickle with cold sweat. Marcus finally exhaled sharply, shaking his head as if brushing off the tension. "It's probably just a moose or something," he muttered, though his voice was tight. He didn't look at either of us when he spoke, but none of us really believed that. After a few minutes, the sound faded. We kept moving, but the forest didn't feel the same after that. The trees seemed denser, the shadows longer, and the silence heavier. With every step, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something large and misshapen moving between the trees. But there was nothing, only the unsettling feeling that something was following us, keeping just out of sight, watching, waiting. We were about 4 miles into the search when the sun dipped behind the ridge, leaving the forest in twilight. The temperature dropped quickly and the already dense woods seemed to close in, suffocating and dark. The three of us pushed on, hoping to cover more ground before nightfall. Though none of us said it out loud, we all knew it was a fool's effort. And that's when we heard it. A long, deep howl, somewhere off in the distance. At first it almost sounded like a wolf, but as the sound carried through the trees, it distorted, growing lower and more guttural, a reverberating gravelly bellow that seemed too large for any animal. We stopped in our tracks. Marcus squinted towards the direction of the sound, his jaw tight. "What in God's name is that?" he asked, his voice low. I looked at him wide-eyed, but before I could speak, the sound came again, closer this time. Leah glanced between us, her face pale. That can't be a bear," she whispered. The three of us stood there, straining to listen, but the forest had fallen into a suffocating silence. No wind, no birds, not even the faint rustle of leaves. Just heavy and encroaching stillness, broken only by the sound of my own heartbeat thudding in my chest. And then the howl came again, and this time it was much closer. I felt my stomach twist. This one was different, deeper, louder, and more aggressive, carrying a menacing resonance that almost seemed directed at us. It started as a low growl but climbed into a wailing roar, vibrating through the trees and sending an icy wave of dread through my chest. Leah clutched her jacket tight around her, her eyes widening and darting. "We need to go," she muttered. Her voice was cracking with fear. Marcus gripped his radio, his knuckles white. "It's just a moose. It must be," he muttered to himself, but I saw the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes scanned the forest with shallow, rapid glances, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was making the sound. But we saw nothing. We stood frozen, listening as the howls seemed to multiply. One echoed from right behind us, another from somewhere deeper in the valley. It was like we were surrounded, but there were no shapes, no movement, just relentless, chilling howls. A sharp crack of branches snapped to our left. My head whipped towards the sound, but the woods were now too dark, just shifting shadows and blackened shapes between the pines. I flicked on my headlamp, my hands trembling slightly. The beam cut through the rising darkness, but there was nothing there, just empty woods. Seconds later, the sound of knocking wood reverberated from ahead, loud and intimidating. "Let's move," Marcus said sharply. His voice was tight with tension. He didn't wait for us to agree, he just started walking, fast. We followed, but the howls and the knocking didn't stop. They grew louder, more guttural and almost enraged, like whatever was making them was warning us back. Leah kept glancing over her shoulder, her face pale and slick with sweat despite the cold. "It's literally trying to circle us," she whispered, her voice cracked slightly. I didn't answer. My legs felt heavy, my boots catching on exposed roots and jutting rocks as I hurried to keep pace. I could feel the burn in my calves as we increased speed, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get the hell out of that forest. For the next 15 minutes, the howls slowly followed us, sometimes distant, sometimes seemingly just beyond the next ridge, always circling, always moving. I don't know if it was one creature or several, but whatever it was staying just out of sight, close enough to be heard, far enough to remain hidden. And the worst part was the gnawing certainty in my gut that it wasn't a predator hunting prey. It was driving us out. It was organised. We hiked out through the night, following our GPS back to the trailhead. We didn't speak. The only sounds were our footsteps, fast and clumsy, as we rushed through the underbrush, tripping over roots and snagging on low branches in our haste. My breath came in short, shallow bursts, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, dreading to see shapes, anything moving between the trees. When we made it back, I reported what we found. The howls, the whispers, Rachel's abandoned gear, and the terrifying feeling of being herded by something unseen. A larger search party went out the next day, but they never found her. Her friends were questioned repeatedly. The official report ruled her as missing, presumed dead, but no body was ever found. No one could explain how she vanished without a trace, and no one ever found any sign of what drove us out. I quit SAR 2 weeks later. I told myself it was because of the emotional strain, but that was only part of it. The real reason? It was the howls. They stayed with me, echoing in my mind whenever I closed my eyes. Sometimes I'd jolt awake in the middle of the night covered in sweat, convinced I could still hear them somewhere just beyond the window, deep and guttural, threading through the dark. I've been hiking in those woods since, but not far, never far, and every so often I swear I can hear those calls again, deep and menacing, and every time I turn back because I know whatever is out there, they don't want to be found, and if someone does find them, they won't let those people leave. I'm 28 and from Oregon. This happened to me when I was 25. I've always liked being out in the woods. I grew up hiking, hunting and camping with my dad and older brother. Over the years I started to take solo trips. A few days out in the middle of nowhere just to decompress. I guess you could say it's my version of hitting reset. In 2022, I planned a solo camping trip to Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in Washington. If you're not familiar with it, Gifford-Pinchot is huge. Over 1 million acres of thick forest, remote valleys, mountains and ridges that feel like they go on forever. Parts of it are so remote there's a good chance that no one's walked through them in years. I had this one spot in mind that I found using a topographic map. A place about 12 miles off the main trail system, tucked up near a ridgeline deep in the forest. No designated trail led there, just a network of barely trodden game paths winding through the trees. The elevation was higher than where most hikers tend to go, and I've never seen a soul up there on previous trips, which is exactly why I liked it. The hike in took most of the day. I set up camp next to a small stream at the base of a ridge, surrounded by towering evergreens and moss-covered stones. The only sounds were the water trickling over rocks and the occasional distant bird call. It felt untouched, peaceful, almost sacred. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. I read by the fire, wandered around looking for animal tracks and cooked simple meals and just enjoyed the quiet. I didn't see a single person the entire time. No planes overhead, no cell signal, just me in the forest. But on the second night, something changed. It wasn't anything huge or dramatic at first, just off. Around midnight, I woke up needing to stretch. I climbed out of the tent and noticed how weirdly silent it was. There was no breeze, no crickets, not even the usual rustling from the underbrush. It was just dead quiet. The kind of silence that instantly I recognized as unusual. Curious, I stood outside for a few minutes, rolling and stretching my neck, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees when I heard a snap. A sharp, unmistakable crack of a thick stick breaking. Not random, not something falling. This sounded like a step. A heavy one, and it came from the ridge above me. I froze and turned off the flashlight and just stood there trying to listen. Another step, then another. It was slow and purposeful. Whatever it was moving laterally across the ridge, parallel to my position. Not towards me, but just tracking above me. It felt intentional, like something knew I was down there and wanted a better look at me. And then it stopped. I froze, turned off the flashlight, and stood there trying to listen. I could hear the brush snapping and bending as though someone or something were pushing through. It was slow, purposeful, and made no attempt to conceal itself. Whatever it was moving laterally across the ridge, parallel to my position, not towards me, but tracking above. It was as though someone or something knew I was down there and wanted to get a better look at me. And then it stopped, and silence returned. I stood there for 10, maybe 15 minutes, not daring to move. No more sounds, no more rustling, nothing. Just the same eerie silence, swallowing everything. I started to feel the rising pressure in my chest. Not exactly fear, but a sort of dread. Like my body knew something before my brain could catch up. Eventually I got back into the tent and lay there with my eyes wide open. The trees creaked in the distance, but nothing came down the ridge. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. Something just didn't feel right. The next morning, with the sun up and the forest back to normal, I decided to hike up to the ridge to see what I could find. The terrain was steep and thick with brush, but I eventually found a narrow trail that ran along the ridge's edge. It was about a foot wide, not maintained but clearly used, probably by animals. Except there weren't any hoof prints, no boots or treads, just these strange deep impressions in the dirt, too far apart for a deer, too clean for an elk, and spaced like something walking upright had made them. About halfway down the trail, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A footprint, or at least a partial one. The front half had landed clean in the mud, a massive imprint showing the ball of a foot, shallow but visible toe marks, and a strange arched shape. It was easily wider than my hand and longer than my entire boot. But there were no claw marks, so it wasn't bare, and no tread, no heel like a boot would leave behind, just the front half of an impossibly large, flat, human-like foot. I took a photo with my phone, but it didn't capture the scale well. Still, I stood there staring at it for a long time. It didn't make any sense. That night, I didn't make a fire. I just sat in my tent after dinner trying to convince myself that it had been an elk or a moose or something normal. But at around 1 AM, the sounds, they started again. I heard steps, same as before, up on the ridge. Only this time they didn't stay on the ridge. They came closer. I was lying in the tent, wide awake, when I heard the slow rhythmic sound of something heavy walking, this time angling down towards the ridge, getting nearer. It stopped right above my camp. Now, the ridge was maybe 30 feet high, but steep enough that anyone or anything standing at the top would have a clear line of sight straight into my tent. I didn't move, I didn't breathe, and that's when I heard it. Not a growl, not a howl, but a deep chesty exhale, like someone forcing air through clenched teeth, low and rough. It came from something with lungs the size of barrels, I was sure. Once, then again, and then nothing. Just the same crushing silence. This time though, it was worse. The silence didn't feel empty, it felt occupied. I could sense something staring down at me. I pictured it standing perfectly still, just behind the tree line, watching, breathing. A few moments later, I began to hear splashing. It was the noise of large rocks being thrown into the water not far from my tent. My heart was pounding. Something was out there, and it wanted me to know that I was not alone. I can't explain what it was like. I'd been in the forest 1,000 times and nothing I've ever encountered acted this way. At one point, I swear I heard the faintest shift of weight on dirt and rock, like whatever was out there had leaned forward and taken a step towards me. I braced myself for whatever was to occur next. I kept imagining the sound of the tent zipper slowly peeling down, but it never did. All I could think about was getting back to civilization. I had the feeling that I had somehow ventured somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, and I had long outstayed my welcome. By early morning the noises began to subside, and thankfully, whatever had been making them eventually moved on. After the sun had long since risen, I finally ventured out of my tent and searched the area. There was nothing. No tracks, no disturbed brush, no sign that anything or anyone had even been there. There was just the forest, calm, normal, like it hadn't been watching me all night. I broke camp within the hour, took a different route out. I didn't eat, I didn't rest, I didn't stop once until I made it back to the truck. It's been 3 years since. I didn't tell anybody about it for a long time. Not because I was afraid they wouldn't believe me, though I knew a lot wouldn't, but because I didn't even know what to say. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person. Whatever it was, it moved with intent. It didn't blunder around like an animal. It didn't stumble or sniff around or run off. It watched me. It followed. And the scariest part for me, it chose not to come down. Because I knew that whatever was standing up there that night, it could have walked straight down into my camp without making a sound, but it didn't. It just stood there, letting me know that it was present. And somehow that seems worse.